The cabin was burning. Alice Merrick stood in the center of the inferno, her hands trembling around the cold steel of a Winchester rifle. Smoke filled her lungs. Heat scorched her face. The scar that ran from her left cheek to her chin, the mark that had defined her entire life, glistened with sweat in the firelight. Across the flames stood Silas Thornwood. His expensive vest was torn, his eyes wild with madness. In each of his pale hands, he gripped the collar of a child, 6-year-old twins, Caleb and Lily Brennan. Their faces were streaked with soot and terror. Silas's voice cut through the roar of the fire like a blade through silk. "Choose, Alice. Sign the deed to Copper Ridge or I shoot one of them. You have 10 seconds." The little boy, Caleb, his face so much like his father's, shouted through his tears, "Don't give him nothing, Ma, Ma." The word hit Alice harder than any bullet could. 3 months ago, these children had been strangers. 3 months ago, she had been a rejected mail-order bride standing in the dirt at Bitter Creek Station, humiliated and alone. 3 months ago, she had been nothing. Now she was everything. The little girl, Lily, whimpered as blood trickled from a gash on her forehead where Silas had thrown her against the cabin wall. Her small fingers reached toward Alice, desperate and trusting. Alice raised the rifle. Her arms shook. The weight of the weapon, the weight of the choice, the weight of 3 lives pressed down on her like a mountain collapsing. Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "You're just like her. Sarah thought she could defy me too. Look where that got her." Sarah. The name of the ghost that haunted this mountain. The name of the woman whose children Alice had sworn to protect. The name of the wife who came before her. Alice looked at Caleb. She looked at Lily. She looked at her own trembling finger on the trigger. She made her choice. The rifle roared. The screen went black. White letters burned onto the darkness. 3 months earlier. The dust of Bitter Creek Station hung in the September air like a judgment. Alice stepped down from the Kansas Pacific Railway car, her worn boots sinking into the red Colorado dirt. The year was 1874. She was 24 years old. She owned nothing but a tattered carpet bag and a stack of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Those letters had promised her a future, a home, a husband, a life far from the cholera-ravaged streets of St. Louis that had swallowed her entire family whole. She waited by the station master's office, trying to ignore the stares of rough miners and unwashed cowboys who paused to look at her. She knew what they saw. A woman past her prime, a woman with a scar, a woman desperate enough to travel halfway across the continent to marry a stranger. The scar ran from her left cheekbone to her jawline, a jagged white line that never tanned, never faded. A gift from a broken loom in the textile mill where she had worked as a child. The machine had shattered. The metal had flown. Her face had paid the price. She pulled her shawl tighter despite the oppressive heat. Bitter Creek was barely a town. False front saloons, a mercantile, a livery stable. All of it clinging to the edge of civilization like a drunk clinging to a bar rail. An hour passed, then 2. The station master, a balding man named Horace, finally stepped out chewing on a matchstick. "You waiting on someone, miss? Train's long gone." "Silas Thornwood," Alice said, keeping her voice steady despite the rising panic in her throat. "He is expecting me." Horace's eyebrows shot up. "Thornwood? Well, I'll be. That's him coming now." Alice smoothed her skirts. She pinched her cheeks to bring color to them. A polished black buggy pulled by 2 matching bay horses trotted up to the station. The vehicle gleamed like a threat. A man stepped down. Silas Thornwood was handsome in the way a well-made knife is handsome. Dangerous and precise. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade. His mustache was trimmed to perfection. His wool suit was tailored in a way that screamed money and power. But his eyes, pale gray and cold, swept over the platform like a man appraising livestock. They landed on Alice. She saw the exact moment his expression changed. Interest to inspection. inspection to disgust. "Are you Alice Merrick?" His tone was clipped, sharp, nothing like the warm words that had filled his letters. "I am." Alice took a hopeful step forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Thornwood, it is a relief to finally meet you." Silas did not take her hand. Instead, he looked her up and down. His gaze lingered on her faded dress, her scuffed boots, the calluses on her fingers, and finally, inevitably, the scar on her face. His lip curled. "You're a liar." The word echoed across the quiet platform. Heads turned. Cowboys loitering by the telegraph office stopped their murmuring. The station master retreated into his office. Alice felt the blood drain from her face. "I beg your pardon?" Silas pulled a small tintype photograph from his breast pocket and held it up. In the image, a younger Alice stared back, unmarred, smooth-skinned, taken before the accident. "This woman is flawless," Silas said, his voice rising to ensure an audience. "You look like a field hand, and you have a ruined face." Alice's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That photograph was taken before the mill accident, Mr. Thornwood. I wrote to you about it. I explained everything in my 4th letter. I don't read the ramblings of desperate spinsters." Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the bundle of letters she had written over 8 months of correspondence, letters where she had poured out her heart, letters where she had trusted him with her truth. He threw them at her feet. They scattered in the dirt like dying birds. "The arrangement is void," Silas said coldly. "Consider your train fare a loss on my part, and your presence a nuisance. Do not contact me again." He turned on his heel, climbed back into his polished buggy, snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of red dust that washed over Alice, coating her dress, stinging her eyes, filling her mouth with the taste of humiliation. She stood frozen. The crowd murmured, pitying, amused, relieved it was not them standing there in the ruins of a dream. Alice had 42 cents in her pocket. She had no family, no place to return to, no means to survive in a territory famous for chewing up the vulnerable and spitting out their bones. She dropped to her knees in the dirt. Her trembling hands reached out to gather the scattered letters, one by one, folding them carefully, as if care could undo the damage, as if dignity could fill an empty stomach. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean track through the dust on her face. "Leave the letters. They're dead words anyway." The voice was deep, resonant, like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. Alice gasped and looked up. The sun was blocked by the sheer mass of the man standing over her. He was a giant, 6 feet 4 inches at least, with shoulders broad enough to blot out the station awning. He wore fringed buckskin pants tucked into knee-high leather boots and a heavy coat over a simple homespun shirt. Dark brown hair fell past his shoulders. A thick beard obscured the lower half of his face. But his eyes, a striking amber gold like a wolf's, were locked onto hers. A Winchester rifle was slung casually over his back. A formidable hunting knife rested at his hip. He looked like the wild mountains made flesh. Alice scrambled to her feet, instinctively taking a step back. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't need charity." The man let out a short, gruff sound that might have been a laugh. "Good, because I ain't offering any." He stepped forward. The crowd that had been watching Alice's humiliation suddenly found reasons to look away and scatter. Even the station master shut his door. This man commanded a terrifying sort of respect. "Name's Josiah Brennan," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, though it remained gravelly. "Folks call me Beck. I own a timber claim and homestead up on Copper Ridge." He jerked a massive thumb over his shoulder toward the dark green peaks rising in the distance. Alice clutched her carpet bag, unsure of what this giant wanted from her. "I am Alice Merrick, or at least, I was supposed to be Alice Thornwood." The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Beck looked down the road where Silas's buggy had disappeared. A dark, dangerous shadow passed over his amber eyes. "Thornwood's a snake," You're lucky he showed his fangs before you let him bite." Alice felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "That brings me little comfort, Mr. Brennan. I am stranded in a town I do not know, without money, and nowhere to sleep tonight." Beck looked at her intently. He took in the faded dress, the sturdy but scuffed boots, the calloused hands gripping the bag, and, finally, the scar on her cheek. Unlike Silas, he did not flinch. He did not look away with disgust. He studied it the way a man assesses the grain of strong oak. "I have 2 children," Beck stated abruptly. "Twins, Caleb and Lily. They're 6 years old. Their mother, my Sarah, passed of winter fever a year back." Alice blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift. "I am sorry for your loss, sir, but I fail to see how that concerns me. Since Sarah died, I've been trying to keep the claim running and raise them both. But the mountain is hard. I'm out logging from dawn till dusk. The twins are running wild. They need schooling. Hot meals. They need someone who won't break at the first sign of hard frost." Beck took another step closer. His presence was overwhelming. Not threatening, but undeniable. "I need a wife, Miss Merrick. Not for romance, for partnership. It ain't safe for a single woman to live in a mountain man's cabin outside of wedlock. The town would talk. The men out here would see you as fair game. I can offer you my name, a roof, protection, and a share of whatever the land yields. In exchange, you raise my children, keep the house, and stand by my side when trouble comes. And trouble will come." Alice stared at him. The proposition was staggering in its bluntness. No pretense of affection, no promises of love, just survival dressed up in legal terms. She looked around Bitter Creek. The saloon doors swung open. Drunken laughter spilled out into the street. If she stayed here, she would be destitute by nightfall. She knew what happened to destitute women in frontier towns. The brothel, the gutter, the unmarked grave. She looked back at Josiah Beck Brennan. There was no warmth in his eyes, but there was honesty. Fierce, undeniable honesty. He was not lying to her. "I have conditions," Alice said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Beck's thick eyebrows rose. A glint of respect flashed in his amber eyes. "Name them." "I expect a legal marriage ceremony performed by a judge before we leave this town. I will not be a kept woman. I expect separate sleeping arrangements. And I expect to be treated with respect, not as an indentured servant." Beck nodded slowly. "Judge Farley's at the courthouse down the street. We'll go now. As for the rest, you have my word. I don't lay a hand on a woman unless invited. And I don't tolerate disrespect under my roof, but I have one rule for you." Alice waited. "If strangers come to Copper Ridge, you shoot first and ask questions later. It ain't safe up there, you understand?" The words should have frightened her. Instead, Alice felt a strange sense of clarity. This man was not hiding the danger. He was preparing her for it. "I understand. Then let's make this legal." 10 minutes later, Alice found herself standing in a dim, dusty magistrate's office that smelled of whiskey and old paper. Judge Amos Farley was a portly man with a permanent red flush to his cheeks and hands that trembled slightly as he opened the marriage ledger. He was clearly intimidated by Beck's looming presence. "You got a witness, Brennan?" the judge asked, his voice slurred. "You'll do," Beck said flatly. Judge Farley rushed through the vows, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. There were no rings, no flowers, no music. When he pronounced them man and wife, Beck simply turned, picked up Alice's carpetbag as if it weighed nothing, and said, "Let's go home, Mrs. Brennan." Alice signed her name in the ledger. Her hand was steady. But as she set down the pen, her eyes caught sight of another entry on the page. An old record half covered by the current ledger. Marriage license. Silas Thornwood and Sarah Winters. Annulled. 1872. Below it, in fresher ink. Marriage license. Josiah Brennan and Sarah Brennan, née Winters. 1872. Alice's breath caught. Sarah Winters, the same woman. Silas's rejected fiancée had become Beck's wife. The man who had just humiliated Alice in the street had once been engaged to the woman whose children Alice was about to raise. She looked up at Beck, but he was already walking toward the door, her bag slung over his shoulder. Alice said nothing, but she filed the information away in the careful, methodical way she had learned to survive. Information was currency, and she had just stumbled onto something valuable. As they left the courthouse, Alice caught a glimpse of a woman standing in the shadow of the boarding house across the street. An older woman, maybe late 50s, with graying hair and a face carved by hard years. The woman stared at Alice with an expression that was not curiosity or judgment. It was recognition and sorrow. The woman's lips moved, forming words Alice could not hear, but she could read lips well enough from her years in the noisy mill. "God protect you, child." Then the woman turned and disappeared into the boarding house. Alice shivered despite the heat. They walked to the livery, where Beck had a massive draft horse, a beast named Goliath, saddled and waiting. The animal was hitched to a sturdy supply wagon loaded with flour, salt, ammunition, and tools. Beck effortlessly lifted Alice onto the wagon seat. His large hands lingered for only a second on her waist, warm through the fabric of her dress, before he climbed up beside her. As they drove out of Bitter Creek, leaving the dusty town and the humiliating ghost of Silas Thornwood behind, the trail immediately began to climb. They were heading into the wilderness, toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks that pierced the sky like broken teeth. Alice wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The reality of what she had just done sank in like stones in deep water. She was legally bound to a giant she knew nothing about, heading into the wild to raise children who belonged to a dead woman who had once been engaged to the man who had rejected Alice hours ago. The coincidence was too great. There was a story here, a dark one, and Alice had a terrible feeling she was about to step into the middle of it. The journey up to Copper Ridge was 4 hours of grueling ascent that tested Alice's nerves and the suspension of the wagon. The dirt road quickly narrowed into a rocky, rutted trail that clung to the side of a deep gorge. Below them, a river churned white and furious, cutting through granite like a knife through butter. Above them, towering ponderosa pines blotted out the late afternoon sun, casting the trail into a cool, eerie twilight. Beck drove the heavy wagon with quiet, masterful ease. He spoke very little, only clicked his tongue to guide Goliath over treacherous washouts. His jaw was tight. His hands gripped the reins with a tension that suggested he was always waiting for something to go wrong. Alice sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, the scent of pine resin and wood smoke that clung to his coat, the controlled power in his movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line as if expecting an attack. The temperature dropped steadily. The heat of the valley was gone, replaced by the crisp, biting chill of high altitude. "Almost there," Beck rumbled, noticing her shivering. He reached behind the seat with one hand and pulled out a heavy, fur-lined buffalo robe. He tossed it over her lap without ceremony. The gesture was absent-minded, but the warmth was immediate and deeply comforting. "Thank you," Alice murmured. "Don't thank me. Need you alive to cook supper." Alice bristled slightly. But she caught a faint glimmer of something in his profile. Not quite amusement, but close. He was testing her. "I assure you, Mr. Brennan, I am heartier than I look, though I cannot promise a gourmet meal on my first night when I do not even know where your skillets are." "Beck," he corrected. "Call me Beck. Mr. Brennan sounds like my father, and he was a bastard." Alice hesitated, then nodded. "Beck," the name felt strange on her tongue, intimate. They rode in silence for another 20 minutes. Then, without warning, Alice began to hum, softly at first, then louder, an old Irish ballad her mother had taught her. "The Parting Glass," a song of farewell and remembrance. Beck's hands jerked on the reins. Goliath snorted in protest. Beck turned to look at her, his amber eyes wide with something Alice could not name: shock, pain, recognition. "Where did you learn that song?" Alice stopped humming, startled by the intensity in his voice. "My mother taught me that song," Alice replied, her voice soft with memory. Beck stared at her for a long moment. His throat worked as if he were swallowing something sharp. "Sarah used to sing it," he said finally, his voice rough. "Every night. To the twins." The air between them grew heavy. Alice did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She simply pulled the buffalo robe tighter around herself and looked away, out at the darkening forest. Beck turned back to the road, but his hands, Alice noticed, were trembling. "Copper Ridge is beautiful," Beck said after a long silence. His voice was flat, emotionless. "But it's also a graveyard. Don't trust the quiet, Alice. Ever." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded like a warning. The trees finally broke, revealing a high-altitude clearing nestled into the shoulder of the mountain. Alice gasped. It was starkly beautiful, but entirely isolated. A sturdy, hand-hewn log cabin sat against a backdrop of sheer granite cliffs, protected from the worst of the northern winds. A plume of gray smoke drifted from a stone chimney. A smaller outbuilding, a barn or woodshed, stood nearby, along with a corral housing a milk cow and a mule. But it was the state of the homestead that caught Alice's practical eye. The porch was cluttered with animal traps, rusted tools, and half-chopped firewood. The windows were grimy. Laundry hung frozen on a line, forgotten. It looked exactly like what it was, the home of a grieving man focused on survival, not comfort. Beck pulled the wagon to a halt and tied off the reins. Before he could even step down, the heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Two small faces peered out from the shadows. They were identical, 6 years old. Mops of unruly shoulder-length brown hair and striking amber eyes. Beck's eyes. They wore oversized, dirt-stained flannel shirts and rough trousers that had been patched many times over. They looked feral, like two wolf pups defending their den. "Caleb, Lily, come out here." Beck's voice was firm, but there was an undercurrent of deep affection that surprised Alice. The twins hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. They did not look at their father. Their hostile glares were locked entirely on Alice. Alice climbed down from the wagon on her own, ignoring Beck's outstretched hand. She walked toward the porch, stopping a few feet away. Then she did something unexpected. She dropped to a crouch, so she was at eye level with the children. "Hello," Alice said softly, keeping her voice even and calm. "I am Alice." The boy, Caleb, spat the words like venom. "You ain't our ma." Alice did not flinch. "No, I am not. Your mother was Sarah, and from what I understand, she was deeply loved. I am not here to replace her. I am here to help your father run this house, to teach you your letters, and to make sure you do not eat dirt for supper." The little girl, Lily, narrowed her eyes. Her small fists clenched at her sides. "Pa said he wasn't never going to bring another woman up the mountain. He lied." Alice stood up and looked back at Beck, raising an eyebrow. Beck ran a massive hand through his dark hair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "Things change, little bird," Beck said to his daughter, stepping up onto the porch and ruffling her dirty hair. "Alice is going to be staying with us. She's my wife now. You will treat her with respect. Understand?" Caleb muttered under his breath, though he backed away from his father's stern tone. "She's too skinny. She'll run off when the first snow hits. They all run off." Alice filed that piece of information away. They all run off. There had been others before her. Women who had tried and failed to survive this mountain, but Alice did not ask about them. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her carpetbag and walked past the children into the cabin. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire in the large stone hearth and the fading light from the grimy windows. The air smelled strongly of old wood smoke, curing leather and unwashed wool. The furniture was massive and handmade. A heavy oak table dominated the center of the room, covered in maps, hunting gear, and dirty tin plates. A steep ladder led up to a sleeping loft where the children presumably slept. In the back corner, separated by a heavy canvas curtain, was the master bed. It was functional, survival-focused, but it was not a home. "It's sturdy," Alice said, trying to find a compliment. "It's a mess," Beck corrected, walking in with a crate of supplies on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. "I told you, I've been working the timber lines. Haven't he had time for scrubbing?" Alice set down her shawl and rolled up the sleeves of her gingham dress. The fear and exhaustion of the day were threatening to overwhelm her, but she knew that if she sat down now, she might shatter. Work was her armor. It always had been. "Where is your water bucket?" Beck pointed to a wooden pail near the door. "Spring's 50 yards out back." Alice turned to the boy, who was watching her suspiciously from the doorway. "Caleb, fetch me a fresh bucket of water." The child stared at her in shock. Clearly, he had been running wild with zero discipline. He looked at his father for salvation. Beck leaned against the doorframe, crossing his massive arms over his chest. The hint of a smirk returned to his lips. "You heard her. Do as she says." Caleb's mouth opened, closed. Then he grabbed the bucket and stomped outside. Alice turned to the little girl. "Lily, find me a rag. We are going to wash this table before we eat." For the next 2 hours, Alice initiated what could only be described as a blitzkrieg on the cabin. With the reluctant help of the twins, she cleared the table, scrubbed the heavy oak surface until it gleamed, swept the dirt from the floorboards, and organized the scattered hunting gear into a sensible corner. She found a sack of flour, some cured bacon, and a jar of preserved apples in the root cellar beneath the floor. Within an hour, she had managed to produce a simple but hearty meal. Biscuits, fried pork, apple compote sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey. When they sat down to eat, the silence was thick. The twins devoured the food ravenously. Their manners were non-existent. They ate with their hands, wiped their mouths on their sleeves, and reached across the table without asking. Beck ate with the quiet focus of a man who viewed food merely as fuel. But Alice noticed him reach for a third biscuit with an appreciative grunt. After dinner, Beck went out to tend to the animals. The sun had fully set. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. Alice heated water over the fire and forced the twins to wash their faces and hands before sending them up the ladder to the loft. They went grudgingly, but the exhaustion of the day's drama seemed to have quelled their rebellion. For tonight, at least. Alone in the quiet cabin, Alice began to wipe down the stone mantel above the hearth. As she moved a heavy cast-iron clock to dust beneath it, a small folded piece of parchment fluttered to the floor. Alice bent down and picked it up. It was a letter. The paper was crisp and expensive, bearing a wax seal that had been broken. She unfolded it, intending to place it back on the mantel, but her eyes caught the signature at the bottom. Silas Thornwood. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at the date. 3 weeks ago. Alice hesitated. Her moral compass warred with her sudden, intense curiosity. The name Silas Thornwood had ruined her life just hours ago. Why was Beck receiving letters from the man he claimed to despise? She read the brief, scrolled text. "Brennan, my patience is wearing thin. The timber on Copper Ridge belongs to the Thornwood Syndicate by right of the original territorial claim. Regardless of what that drunken judge says, you will sell the lower acreage to me by the end of the month, or I will take alternative measures. I will not allow a squatter to ruin my expansion. Remember what happened the last time you defied me. S. T. Alice's breath hitched. Remember what happened the last time you defied me. The heavy cabin door swung open. Cold mountain wind swept inside, guttering the candles. Beck stood in the doorway, a load of firewood in his arms. He froze when he saw Alice standing by the hearth, the letter in her hand. The icy gold of his eyes darkened into something dangerous. He dropped the wood into the bin with a loud crash that made Alice jump. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, snatched the letter from her trembling fingers, and threw it directly into the fire. The expensive paper curled and blackened consumed by flames. "I told you I'd treat you with respect, Alice," Beck said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried more menace than a shout. "But there's one rule in this house. You do not pry into my business with Thornwood, and you never, ever mention my wife's death." He turned and walked toward the canvas curtain that shielded his bed. "Take the cot near the fire tonight. Tomorrow the real work begins." Alice stood by the hearth watching the expensive paper turn to ash in the flames. She had sought a safe haven from a cruel man, only to realize she had just bound herself to a man who was fighting a war against him. And somehow she was caught right in the middle. Alice did not sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot near the fire, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, staring at the ceiling beams. Her mind raced. Sarah Winters had been engaged to Silas Thornwood. Then she had married Beck. Then she had died. And Silas was now threatening Beck, referencing something that had happened the last time Beck defied him. The pieces did not fit together cleanly, but they formed the shape of something dark. From behind the canvas curtain, Alice heard Beck's breathing. It was not the steady rhythm of sleep. It was ragged, uneven. Then, just past midnight, he began to scream. Not words, just raw, guttural sounds of anguish. Alice sat up, her heart pounded. She looked toward the loft. The twins did not stir. They were used to this, she realized. Their father's nightmares were a regular occurrence. She should stay on her cot. Mind her own business, follow the rules. But Alice had never been good at following rules that made no sense. She stood, crossed the room, hesitated at the canvas curtain. Then she pulled it aside. Beck was thrashing in his bed, tangled in sheets, his face contorted in terror. Sweat poured down his bare chest. His hands clawed at invisible enemies. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Don't go to town. He'll find you. Sarah!" Alice stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Beck, wake up." His eyes flew open, wild, unseeing. In one swift, violent motion, he grabbed Alice by the throat and slammed her against the wall. His hand was a vice. His eyes were those of a man still trapped in a nightmare, not recognizing where he was or who she was. Alice did not scream, did not struggle. She simply looked into his eyes and spoke calmly. "It's me, Alice. You're safe." Recognition flickered. His grip loosened. His hand fell away. Beck staggered back, breathing hard, his face stricken with horror. "Jesus," he choked out. "I could have killed you." Alice rubbed her throat. It would bruise, but she kept her voice steady. "But you didn't." Beck turned away, running both hands through his hair. "You should have stayed on your side of the room." "You were screaming her name," Alice said quietly. "Sarah. What happened to her, Beck?" Beck's shoulders hunched. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "She died because I failed her. That's all you need to know." "That's not all I need to know," Alice countered. "I saw the letter. Silas threatened you. He said, 'Remember what happened last time.'" "What did he do, Beck?" Beck spun around, his eyes blazing. "It's none of your concern." "I'm your wife," Alice said, stepping closer. "That makes it my concern." "You're my wife on paper," Beck roared, his control finally snapping. "Don't mistake a legal contract for intimacy. Don't mistake survival for trust." The words hit Alice like a slap. She stood there, small and defiant in her nightgown, staring up at a man twice her size, who was unraveling before her eyes. "Fine," Alice said coldly. "Keep your secrets. But when Silas Thornwood comes for you, and he will come, don't expect me to stand beside a man who treats me like a servant instead of a partner." She turned and walked back to her cot. Behind her, she heard Beck's ragged breathing, heard the creak of the bed as he sat down heavily. Then, so quiet she almost missed it, she heard him whisper, "I'm sorry." Alice did not respond. She pulled the blanket over herself and closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called out to the moon. And Alice Merrick, now Alice Brennan, lay in the darkness and wondered what kind of hell she had walked into, and whether she was strong enough to survive it. End of Part 1. The first 3 weeks on Copper Ridge passed in a rhythm of quiet battles and small victories. Alice woke each morning before dawn, when the world was still black and the cold bit through the cabin walls like teeth. She would light the fire, her breath misting in the frigid air, and set water to boil for coffee. By the time Beck emerged from behind the canvas curtain, the cabin would be warm, and the smell of cornmeal mush or fried salt pork would fill the air. He never thanked her, but he always ate. Then he would take his rifle, his axe, and disappear into the timber before the sun had fully crested the eastern peaks. Sometimes he would be gone until well past dark. Alice would hear him return, the heavy thud of his boots on the porch, the clatter of tools being set down. He would eat whatever she had kept warm for him. Then he would check on the sleeping twins and retreat behind his curtain. They existed in the same space but moved through different worlds. The twins, Caleb and Lily, were Alice's true challenge. Caleb was a fortress. Silent, watchful, always positioned between his sister and Alice, as if ready to defend against an attack. He carried a small hunting knife on his belt, a miniature version of his father's blade, and he handled it with unsettling competence for a 6-year-old boy. He would not speak to Alice unless absolutely necessary. When she tried to teach him his letters, he would stare at the slate board with defiant blankness, refusing to pick up the chalk. But Alice noticed things. She noticed that when she wrote words on the board, his eyes followed. She noticed that when she left books open on the table, he would creep closer when he thought she was not looking. She noticed that he listened, even when he pretended not to. Lily was different. She was a storm of emotions barely contained in a small body. She would swing from rage to tears to laughter within the span of minutes. She asked endless questions, most of them designed to test Alice's resolve. Why do we have to wash? Ma never made us wash every day. Why do we have to eat vegetables? Pa says meat makes you strong. Why do you have that ugly scar? Does it hurt? Alice answered every question with patience she did not know she possessed. We wash because illness spreads in dirt, and I will not bury children because of lice. Meat makes you strong, but vegetables keep you from getting scurvy and losing your teeth. The scar does not hurt anymore. It is just a reminder that I survived. On the 7th day, Alice made a decision. She was teaching Lily how to form letters on the slate when she wrote a name at the top of the board, Sarah Brennan, beloved mother. Lily's small hand froze. Her eyes filled with tears. Caleb, who had been sitting in the corner pretending to whittle, looked up sharply. "What are you doing?" His voice was hoarse, as if he had not used it in days. Alice set down the chalk and turned to face both children. "I am writing your mother's name because she deserves to be remembered, and because I am not here to make you forget her." Caleb stood up, his knife still in his hand. His face was a war between anger and something softer, something desperate. "You spelled beloved wrong," he said finally. Alice looked at the board. He was right. She had written B-E-L-O-V-E-D. She picked up the chalk and corrected it. "You are right. Thank you, Caleb." The boy stared at her. Then slowly he walked over to the table. He picked up a piece of chalk, and he began to write. It was the first day Caleb Brennan chose to trust Alice, even just a little. On the 14th day, disaster struck. Alice was hauling water from the spring, a task that required navigating a steep, rocky path through the trees. The wooden bucket was heavy, sloshing icy water onto her skirts. Her hands were numb despite the worn gloves Beck had grudgingly given her. She was halfway back to the cabin when her boot slipped on a patch of wet moss. The world tilted. The bucket flew from her hands. Alice fell hard, her knee slamming into a jagged rock. Pain exploded through her leg, white hot and blinding. She bit down on a scream, forcing herself to breathe through the agony. When she looked down, her skirt was torn. Blood seeped through the fabric, dark and spreading. Alice tried to stand. Her leg buckled. She went down again, this time catching herself on her palms. Stones bit into her skin. She heard the crunch of boots on the path. Beck appeared, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move. He must have seen her fall from the timberline. He dropped to one knee beside her, his face a mask of controlled alarm. "Where are you hurt?" "My knee, I slipped." Beck did not ask permission. He simply tore the fabric of her skirt, exposing the wound. It was deep, a gash that would need stitching. Blood ran down her shin. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he scooped Alice up as if she weighed nothing, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. He carried her up the path toward the cabin, his stride steady despite the uneven ground. Alice wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, but the pain was making her dizzy, and the warmth of his body was an unexpected comfort. "You're tougher than you look, city girl," Beck said quietly as he kicked open the cabin door. It was the first compliment he had ever given her. Alice did not trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded. Beck set her down on the table, clearing away maps and tools with one sweep of his arm. He disappeared into the back of the cabin and returned with a leather satchel that smelled of whiskey and herbs. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Everything hurts," Alice replied. "Get on with it." The corner of Beck's mouth twitched, almost a smile. He cleaned the wound with whiskey. Alice bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. Then he stitched it closed with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle. When he was done, he wrapped her knee in clean linen and stepped back. "You'll be limping for a week. No hauling water. Caleb can do it. Caleb is 6 years old. Caleb is stronger than you think, and he needs to learn that when someone in this family is hurt, the rest of us step up. Family." It was the first time Beck had used that word to include her. Alice looked up at him, this mountain of a man with secrets carved into every line of his face, and felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you, Beck." He grunted and turned away, already reaching for his coat. "Don't make me regret keeping you alive." But his voice was softer than his words. On the 21st day, everything changed. It started with a sound in the night, a low, wet cough that rattled through the loft like a death knell. Alice woke instantly, her heart already racing. She had heard that sound before, in the tenements of St. Louis, in the quarantine wards where her family had died. She threw off her blanket and climbed the ladder to the loft, her injured knee screaming in protest. Caleb was sitting up in his small bed, his face flushed with fever. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Lily was curled beside him, crying softly. Alice pressed her hand to Caleb's forehead. His skin was burning. "Beck!" Alice shouted. "Beck!" The canvas curtain ripped open. Beck appeared, pulling on his pants, his face already draining of color. He took one look at Caleb and froze. Alice recognized the look. It was the look of a man staring at his worst nightmare made real. "No," Beck whispered. "No, not again. Not the fever." He stood there, paralyzed, his hands shaking. Alice grabbed his arm and shook him hard. "Beck, I need you to focus. Get me snow from outside. As much as you can carry. Now!" The command in her voice snapped him out of his paralysis. He stumbled toward the door and disappeared into the night. Alice turned to Lily. "Sweetheart, I need you to be very brave. Go down to the root cellar and bring me the jar of willow bark. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, tears streaming down her face, and scrambled down the ladder. Alice stripped Caleb out of his sweat-soaked shirt and laid him flat. His small body was racked with shivers despite the heat radiating from his skin. He was muttering, delirious. "Ma, don't let the bad man take us. He hurt you, Ma. He hurt you." Alice's blood ran cold. The bad man. But there was no time to unpack that now. Beck returned with an armload of snow. Lily appeared with the willow bark. Alice worked with the focused intensity of someone who had fought this battle before and lost. She packed snow around Caleb's body to bring down the fever. She brewed willow bark tea and forced it between his cracked lips, drop by drop, even as he thrashed and fought her. She kept the fire roaring to sweat the sickness out. Beck sat in the corner, his head in his hands, his massive frame shaking. Hours passed. The night stretched into a hellish eternity. Caleb's fever spiked to a terrifying height. His lips turned blue. His breathing became a rattle. Beck let out a sound Alice would never forget, a raw animal howl of despair. "I can't lose him," he choked out. "I can't. Not like Sarah. Please, God, not like Sarah." Alice did not stop working. She changed the snowpacks. She dripped more tea into Caleb's mouth. She sang softly, the same Irish lullaby her mother had sung to her, The Parting Glass. And she prayed. At dawn, 40 hours after the fever began, Caleb broke into a sweat. The crisis had passed. Alice collapsed against the wall of the loft, her hands shaking, her vision blurred with exhaustion. Beck crawled over to his son and gathered the sleeping boy into his arms, rocking him gently, tears streaming down his bearded face. "You saved him," Beck whispered, looking at Alice over Caleb's small head. "Sarah couldn't. I couldn't, but you did." Alice could not respond. She was too tired, too wrung out. She simply closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. When Alice woke, she was in Beck's bed. She sat up with a gasp, disoriented. Sunlight streamed through the window. It was late afternoon. She had slept for nearly 12 hours. The canvas curtain was pulled back. Beck sat in a chair beside the bed, watching her with an expression she could not read. "The twins?" Alice asked immediately. "Both fine. Caleb's fever broke completely. He's weak, but he's eating. Lily hasn't left his side." Alice exhaled in relief. Then she realized she was wearing a clean nightgown that was not hers. Someone had undressed her, washed the blood and sweat from her skin, and put her to bed. Her face flushed. Beck saw her expression and shook his head. "It was Lily, not me. I carried you down here, but she insisted on taking care of you. Said you took care of Caleb, so she'd take care of you." Alice felt tears prick her eyes. Beck leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His amber eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, but clearer than she had ever seen them. "I need to tell you the truth, Alice. About Sarah. About Silas. About why we're not safe here." Alice waited. Beck took a deep breath. 2 years ago, Silas Thornwood wanted this ridge, the timber rights, the water access, everything. I refused to sell. He tried bribing me, threatening me. When that didn't work, he went after Sarah. Beck's hands clenched into fists. "Sarah and Silas were engaged before she met me. Did you know that?" Alice nodded slowly. "I saw the marriage record at the courthouse." Beck looked surprised, but he continued. "Silas courted her properly. Gifts, promises, the whole performance. But a week before the wedding, Sarah saw him beat a worker to death for talking back. She realized what kind of man he really was. She broke the engagement and ran. That's when she came to Copper Ridge. That's when she found me." Beck stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains. "We fell in love, fast and hard. I married her within a month. We had the twins 9 months later. For a year, we were happy. I thought Silas had moved on. I was wrong." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The winter Sarah died. The fever swept through the valley. She got sick first. I rode down to Bitter Creek for medicine, for quinine, for a doctor. But Silas had men waiting at the toll bridge. They knew I was coming. They told me I could pass if I signed over the deed to Copper Ridge right there in the snow." Beck's shoulders shook. "I fought them. I put 2 of them down, but they shot my horse out from under me. By the time I hiked back up this mountain on foot, it had been 18 hours. Sarah was already gone. She died calling my name, begging me to protect the twins from him." Alice stood and crossed the room. She placed her hand on Beck's back, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring ready to snap. "It was not your fault," she said quietly. "It was," Beck insisted. "I should have given him the land. I should have chosen her over my pride." "He would have killed her anyway," Alice said with certainty. "Men like Silas do not forgive rejection. If you had given him the land, he would have found another way to punish you, another excuse. You know this." Beck turned to face her. His eyes were raw with grief and something else, something that looked like hope. "You saved Caleb, Alice. You did what I couldn't do for Sarah. You fought death, and you won." Alice shook her head. "We fought death, together. Beck reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. His thumb traced the line of her scar with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "You are the strongest thing I have ever seen," he murmured. And then he kissed her. It was not gentle. It was desperate, fierce, a collision of two people who had been holding themselves together by sheer force of will and could not do it any more. Alice kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Beck rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling for you, Alice Brennan, and it terrifies me." Alice smiled, a real smile, the first in longer than she could remember. "Good. We can be terrified together." The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of cautious happiness. Beck began talking to Alice, really talking. He told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about coming west to escape a violent father, about building the cabin with his own hands. He told her about Sarah, not with the tortured grief of before, but with fondness, with permission to remember her without drowning in guilt. Alice told him about St. Louis, about watching her family die one by one in the cholera ward, about working in the textile mill from the age of 10, about the day the loom exploded and carved her face open, about lying in the charity hospital, looking in a mirror, and realizing her life, as she had imagined it, was over. They talked late into the nights, sitting by the fire while the twins slept above them, and slowly, carefully, they began to build something neither of them had expected: trust. But the mountain, as Beck had warned, was not a place that allowed happiness to grow unchecked. The blizzard hit on the first day of November. It came without warning, a wall of white that descended from the peaks and swallowed Copper Ridge whole. Within hours, 3 feet of snow blanketed the clearing. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. Beck secured the animals in the barn. He brought in firewood until it was stacked to the ceiling. He checked and rechecked the chimney, the windows, the door seals. They were trapped. For 2 weeks, the world shrank to the size of the cabin. Beck could not hunt, could not log, could not leave. The 4 of them were pressed together in close quarters, forced to navigate each other's moods and needs with nowhere to escape. It should have been unbearable. Instead, it became something else. Lily taught Alice how to braid hair, sitting between Alice's knees by the fire, chattering endlessly about everything and nothing. Caleb, emboldened by his recovery, began to show Alice his carvings, small wooden animals he whittled with his knife. A bear, a wolf, an eagle. Beck taught Alice how to play chess using pieces he had carved years ago. She was terrible at it, but she laughed when he captured her queen for the 5th time in a row, and the sound of her laughter made something in Beck's chest crack open. On the 10th day of the blizzard, Alice was searching the loft for extra blankets when she found a small wooden box hidden beneath Lily's thin mattress. Inside was a collection of treasures: a smooth river stone, a blue bird feather, a button that must have come from Sarah's dress. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a ring. Alice lifted it carefully. It was platinum, expensive, engraved with elegant script: S.T. to S.W. Forever mine. 1872. Silas Thornwood to Sarah Winters. Alice's heart began to pound. She turned the ring over in her fingers, her mind racing. Sarah had kept it. Even after marrying Beck, even after fleeing Silas, she had kept this ring and hidden it where her husband would never find it. Why? Alice heard the creak of the ladder. She quickly wrapped the ring back in the cloth and closed the box, but not before Lily's small voice said from behind her, "That was Ma's secret." Alice turned. Lily stood at the top of the ladder, her amber eyes solemn. "Ma said never to show Pa. She said the ring was from the bad man, the man who hurt her." Alice knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. "Did your mama tell you anything else about the bad man?" Lily nodded slowly. "She said he used to come to the cabin sometimes when Pa was away. He would stand in the trees and watch us. Ma would see him and get real scared. She would lock the door and make us hide under the bed." Alice's blood turned to ice. "When did this happen, sweetheart? Before your mama got sick?" "Right before. Lily whispered. "The week before she died. Ma told Pa, but he didn't believe her. He said she was seeing ghosts. Then Ma got the fever, and then she was gone." Alice pulled Lily into a tight embrace, her mind spinning. Silas had been stalking Sarah, watching the cabin, terrifying her, and when Beck dismissed her fears as paranoia, she had kept the evidence. The ring. Proof that Silas was still obsessed with her, but there was something else. Something darker. What if Sarah's fever had not been natural? What if Silas had done more than block Beck from getting medicine? What if he had caused the illness itself? Alice held Lily and stared at the ring, and for the first time since arriving on Copper Ridge, she understood the true depth of the danger they were in. Silas Thornwood was not just a greedy landowner. He was a killer. And he was not finished. That night, after the twins were asleep, Alice showed Beck the ring. His reaction was immediate and violent. He grabbed the ring and hurled it into the fire. "Where did you get that?" His voice was deadly quiet. "Lily had it. Hidden in a box. Beck, Sarah kept it for a reason." "I don't care what her reasons were. That ring is poison. Everything Silas touches turns to poison." "Beck, listen to me." Alice grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Lily said Silas was watching the cabin before Sarah died, that he was stalking her. What if he did more than just block you from getting medicine? What if he poisoned her? Beck stared at Alice as if she had struck him. That's impossible. The whole valley had the fever that winter. Did they, or did Silas spread rumors to cover his tracks? Beck turned away, running his hands through his hair. But Alice could see the doubt creeping in, the terrible possibility taking root. "I need to know the truth," Beck said finally. "I need to know if he killed her." "Then we go to Bitter Creek," Alice said. "We find proof. We end this." Beck looked at her, his amber eyes fierce. "If we do this, there's no going back. Silas will come for us with everything he has." Alice thought of Caleb's fever, of Lily's fear, of the ring hidden in a child's treasure box, of the letter threatening Beck. She thought of the cold open from her nightmares, the cabin burning, the choice she would have to make, and she realized that the nightmare was not a vision of the future, it was a warning. "Then let him come," Alice said. "I'm done running. I'm done being afraid. And I'm done letting men like Silas Thornwood destroy families." Beck searched her face. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a grim smile, a warrior's smile. "You're going to get us both killed, Mrs. Brennan." "Probably," Alice agreed. "But we'll go down fighting." Beck pulled her close and kissed her hard. A promise and a declaration of war rolled into one. When they broke apart, he said, "We leave at first light. Martha needs to know what we're planning." "Martha?" Alice asked, confused. Beck's expression grew complicated. "Martha Brennan. She runs the boarding house in Bitter Creek. She's Sarah's older sister, and she's the only person in that town who might help us bring Silas down." Alice's eyes widened. Another secret. Another piece of the puzzle falling into place. "You should have told me." "I know," Beck said quietly. "I'm telling you now. No more secrets, Alice. Not between us." Alice nodded. They spent the rest of the night preparing, packing supplies, loading the rifle, making plans. And outside, the blizzard finally began to break. The storm was ending. But another, far more dangerous, was about to begin. End of Part 2. The descent from Copper Ridge began at dawn, when the world was caught between night and day, shadow and light. Beck drove the wagon with grim determination, his rifle propped within easy reach. Alice sat beside him, her own Winchester resting across her lap. The weight of the weapon was no longer foreign to her. Over the 2 weeks since the blizzard broke, Beck had spent every afternoon teaching her to shoot. Not well, but well enough to stop a man if she had to. The twins had been left with Martha, who had made the treacherous journey up to the cabin 3 days prior. The older woman had arrived with supplies and information, her weathered face grave with worry. Alice had liked her immediately. Martha Brennan had the same amber eyes as her sister Sarah, though hers were harder, carved by loss and survival. She had pulled Alice aside while Beck was outside tending the horses and spoken with quiet intensity. "You look like her, you know." Not in features, but in spirit. Sarah had that same stubborn fire, that same refusal to break. Martha had gripped Alice's hands. But stubbornness wasn't enough to save her. You need to be smarter than she was, more careful. Silas is a snake, but he's a patient snake. He'll wait for the perfect moment to strike. Then we won't give him that moment, Alice had replied. Martha's smile had been sad. That's what Sarah said, too. Now, as the wagon rattled down the mountain trail, Alice replayed that conversation in her mind. She understood the warning beneath Martha's words. Sarah had fought Silas and lost. The question was whether Alice would make the same mistakes, or whether she would learn from them. Beck's voice broke through her thoughts. When we get to town, let me do the talking. Silas has influence. Judge Farley, Sheriff Kane, half the businessmen on Main Street, they're all in his pocket. Then how do we expose him? Beck's jaw tightened. We don't expose him to the town. We expose him to someone he can't buy, someone who has more power than he does. Who? Major John Wesley. He's the purchasing agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. General Palmer sent him to negotiate timber contracts for the expansion. Silas has been courting him for months, trying to secure an exclusive deal. If we can prove to Wesley that Silas is a fraud and a criminal, the railroad will pull their support. And without the railroad contract, Silas's whole empire collapses. Alice absorbed this. What proof do we have? Beck pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket. Sarah's letter, the one I found after she died. She wrote down everything. Every threat Silas made, every bribe he paid, every crime he committed. She was documenting it, trying to build a case. I think she was planning to go to the law before she got sick. He handed the envelope to Alice. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in elegant, feminine handwriting. As Alice read, her chest tightened. My dearest Beck, if you are reading this, I am gone. I need you to know the truth. Silas Thornwood has not accepted our marriage. He has been watching us, following me when I go to town, bribing officials to keep our marriage in legal limbo. Judge Farley told me privately that our marriage license was never fully filed. In the eyes of the law, we may not be legally wed, which means Caleb and Lily could be declared illegitimate. Silas told me this himself when he cornered me behind the mercantile last month. He said if anything happened to you, he would claim custody of the children as my rightful betrothed. Please, Beck, protect them. Find someone strong, someone who will not break when he comes. I am sorry I was not strong enough. Your Sarah. Alice's hands trembled as she folded the letter. She knew, Alice whispered. She knew he was going to kill her. Not kill her, Beck said, his voice hollow, but destroy her, break her, make her so afraid that she would come back to him. That's what Silas does. He doesn't just take what he wants, he makes you beg him to take it. Alice looked at Beck's profile, saw the muscle ticking in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on the reins. We're going to stop him, she said firmly. Not just for Sarah, for Caleb and Lily, for every woman he's hurt. Beck glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. When this is over, I'm building you a house down in the valley, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere you can plant a garden and not worry about blizzards or madmen. Alice smiled faintly. I like the mountain. It suits me. You're insane. Probably, but so are you, mountain man. We make a good pair. Beck's hand found hers on the seat between them. He squeezed once, a silent promise. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the weight of what was coming settling over them like snow. Bitter Creek had not changed. The same dusty streets, the same false front buildings, the same rough men lounging outside the saloon, watching strangers with lazy suspicion. But Alice was not the same woman who had stepped off the train 3 months ago. That woman had been broken, desperate, willing to accept crumbs. This woman was a wife, a mother, a fighter. This woman was dangerous. Beck pulled the wagon to a stop outside the courthouse. The building was small, barely more than a shack with delusions of grandeur. But it was where Judge Farley held court, and it was where they would find their first piece of evidence. "Stay close," Beck murmured as he helped Alice down from the wagon. "And if shooting starts, you get behind cover. Understand?" "If shooting starts, I'm shooting back," Alice replied calmly. Beck looked like he wanted to argue. Then he saw the set of her jaw and thought better of it. They entered the courthouse. Judge Amos Farley sat behind a scarred wooden desk, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, papers scattered in front of him. He looked up as they entered, and his ruddy face went pale. "Brennan, Mrs. Brennan, I wasn't expecting you." "I need to see the marriage records," Beck said without preamble. "Specifically, the record of my marriage to Sarah Winters in 1872. The judge's hands began to shake. "Now, Beck, that's confidential information. I can't just go handing out legal documents to every Tom, Dick, and—" Beck crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the judge by his collar, and hauled him half out of his chair. "I wasn't asking, Amos." The judge's eyes went wide with terror. All right, let me go and I'll get the file." Beck released him. The judge stumbled to a filing cabinet in the corner, his hands fumbling with the lock. After a moment, he pulled out a thin folder and set it on the desk. Beck opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the marriage license for Silas Thornwood and Sarah Winters, dated March 1872. Stamped in red ink across the top was the word "annulled." The second document was the marriage license for Josiah Brennan and Sarah Winters, dated June 1872. But there was no official seal, no registration number, no witness signatures beyond Judge Farley's scrawled name. It was not a legal marriage. It was a piece of paper. Alice felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You never filed it," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You married them, took Beck's money, and never filed the paperwork with the territorial office." Judge Farley would not meet her eyes. "Silas paid me to delay it, just for a few months," he said. "Just until he could convince Sarah to come back to him. I didn't think it would matter. I thought they'd work it out like reasonable people." Beck's fist slammed into the desk, splintering the wood. "My children are illegitimate because you took a bribe?" "I'm sorry, Beck. I swear I didn't know Silas would—" "You knew exactly what he would do," Alice cut in. "You knew, and you did it anyway." "How much did he pay you, Judge?" Farley swallowed hard. $500. He said he'd make the charges disappear if I did what he asked." Alice felt bile rise in her throat. Beck's expression had gone utterly cold. "Where's your daughter now?" "Living with my sister in Denver. I sent her away to keep her safe from him." Alice stepped forward and placed a hand on the judge's trembling shoulder. "Then help us destroy him. Testify against him. Tell Major Wesley everything. It's the only way Emily will ever be truly safe." Judge Farley looked up at her, his eyes red and wet. "He'll kill me." "He'll kill you anyway," Beck said flatly. "The only question is whether you die a coward or a man who tried to do the right thing." The judge stared at them both for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll testify. God help me. I'll testify." They found Major John Wesley at the Silver Spur Hotel, a relatively upscale establishment by Bitter Creek standards. He was a trim man in his mid-40s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of a career military officer. He sat in the hotel restaurant, reviewing contracts over coffee. Beck approached his table with Alice at his side. "Major Wesley, I'm Josiah Brennan. I own timber rights on Copper Ridge. I need to speak with you about Silas Thornwood." Wesley looked up, his sharp eyes assessing them both. "I have a meeting with Mr. Thornwood in an hour. If you have concerns about his business practices, I suggest you take them up with him directly." "I have proof that Silas Thornwood is a fraud, a criminal, and a murderer," Alice said calmly. "And if you sign a contract with him, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad will be complicit in his crimes." Wesley's expression did not change, but he gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Sit. You have 5 minutes." They sat. Beck laid out the evidence. Sarah's letter, the unfiled marriage license, Judge Farley's confession about the bribery and the assault on his daughter. Alice added her own testimony, the rejection at the train station, the threatening letter Beck had received. Silas's obsession with owning Copper Ridge at any cost. When they finished, Wesley sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Brennan. Do you understand that if you're lying, I could have you arrested for slander?" "I'm not lying," Beck said. "Then you won't mind if I investigate these claims before making any decisions about the railroad contract?" Alice leaned forward. "Major, while you're investigating, Silas will be preparing. He has half this town on his payroll. He'll bury the evidence, intimidate witnesses, and disappear anything that connects him to his crimes. If you want the truth, you need to act now. Today." Wesley studied her for a long moment. "You're quite passionate about this, Mrs. Brennan." "I'm quite tired of men like Silas Thornwood ruining lives and calling it business." A flicker of respect crossed Wesley's face. "Very well. I'll confront Thornwood this afternoon, in public. If what you say is true, his reaction will tell me everything I need to know. But I want you both there. Can you do that?" "Yes," Beck and Alice said in unison. Wesley nodded. "Then meet me in the town square at 2 o'clock, and bring Judge Farley. If this goes badly, we'll need every witness we can get." At precisely 2 o'clock, the town square of Bitter Creek filled with an unusual crowd. Word had spread that something important was about to happen. Miners, cowboys, shopkeepers, and curious townsfolk gathered in a loose circle around the center of the square. Silas Thornwood stood near his polished black buggy, dressed impeccably as always, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He was speaking with Major Wesley, his expression confident, almost smug. Beck, Alice, and Judge Farley stood across from them, forming a line. Martha had arrived as well, standing slightly behind Alice, her face set in grim determination. Silas noticed them. His smile faltered for just a moment, then it returned, sharper than before. "Brennan, I see you've brought the whole family. How touching." Beck did not respond. He simply stared at Silas with the cold, predatory focus of a wolf watching its prey. Major Wesley cleared his throat. "Mr. Thornwood, I've received some troubling information about your business practices. Before I finalize our contract, I need you to address these concerns." Silas's smile tightened. "Of course, Major. I'm an open book." "Are you?" Alice stepped forward, her voice carrying across the square. "Then perhaps you can explain why you bribed Judge Farley to falsify marriage records, or why you assaulted his 16-year-old daughter and had her arrested on false charges when she fought back." The crowd murmured. Silas's face went red. "That's a lie. A desperate, pathetic lie from a scarred spinster who's bitter I rejected her." Alice did not flinch. "Then explain this." She held up Sarah's letter, unfolding it so the crowd could see the elegant handwriting. "This is a letter written by Sarah Brennan before she died. In it, she details your threats, your stalking, your attempts to invalidate her marriage so you could claim custody of her children. She was building a case against you, Silas. And then she conveniently died of a fever that swept through the valley, a fever no one else in Bitter Creek caught. Funny, isn't it?" Silas's face went from red to white. "You have no proof. That letter is a forgery." "Is it?" Judge Farley stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. "Because I can confirm that Silas Thornwood paid me $500 to delay filing the Brennan marriage license. He told me it was temporary. But Sarah died before I could correct it, and he never asked me to file it after her death. He wanted those children declared illegitimate so he could claim them." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Silas turned on the judge, his composure cracking. "You drunken fool! You were supposed to keep your mouth shut." "I'm done keeping your secrets," Farley said. "I'm done being your puppet." Martha stepped forward now, her voice ringing clear. "I'm Martha Brennan. Sarah Winters was my younger sister. Silas Thornwood courted her in 1872, when she tried to break their engagement because she witnessed him kill a man he threatened to destroy her. When she married Beck and escaped to Copper Ridge, Silas had my husband killed and our house burned to the ground. He's been terrorizing this family for 3 years, and I can prove it." She held up a stack of letters, scorched at the edges but still readable. These are letters Silas sent to Sarah after she married Beck. Threatening letters, obsessive letters, letters where he describes in detail how he'll take everything from her if she doesn't come back to him. Silas's control shattered. He lunged for Martha, his hand reaching for the derringer he kept in his vest pocket. "You bitch! I'll—" The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Dirt exploded at Silas's feet. Everyone turned. Alice stood with the Winchester raised to her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel, her expression utterly calm. "Take one more step toward her," Alice said quietly, "and the next bullet goes through your knee." Silas froze, his hand still on his hidden weapon. Sheriff Kane, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, finally moved. He walked forward, his hand on his own gun. For a moment, Alice thought he was going to arrest her. Instead, he stopped in front of Silas. "Silas Thornwood, you're under arrest for bribery, conspiracy, assault, and attempted murder." Silas's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You work for me, Kane. I own you." "Worked," the sheriff corrected. "Past tense. Your money's good, Thornwood, but it's not worth hanging for. And I got a daughter, too. I'll be damned if I let a man like you walk free." Major Wesley stepped forward, his face carved from stone. "Mr. Thornwood, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad will not be doing business with you. Consider our negotiations terminated. Furthermore, I will be recommending to General Palmer that a formal investigation be opened into your activities." Silas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You think you've won? She's still dead, Sarah's still dead, and you'll never get her back, Brennan. Never." Beck walked forward slowly, deliberately, until he was standing directly in front of Silas. He towered over the smaller man, his presence overwhelming. "I know," Beck said quietly, "but I have Alice, and Caleb, and Lily, and Martha. I have a family that you'll never touch again. Sarah is at peace. You're the one who'll live in hell." Beck turned his back on Silas, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to Alice. He took the rifle gently from her hands and pulled her into his arms. The crowd watched as Sheriff Kane placed iron shackles on Silas Thornwood's wrists and led him toward the jail. The devil had been bound, at least for now. 3 weeks later, spring arrived on Copper Ridge. 3 weeks after Silas Thornwood was led away in chains, Alice woke screaming. Beck was beside her in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, his voice urgent. "Alice, Alice, wake up. It's just a dream." She sat up, gasping. Her nightgown soaked with sweat. Her hands were shaking. "The cabin was burning," she choked out. "Silas had the twins. He made me choose. Sign the deed or he'd shoot one of them. I raised the rifle and I... It wasn't real," Beck said firmly, pulling her against his chest. "Silas is in prison. The twins are asleep upstairs. We're safe." Alice buried her face in his shoulder, her breathing gradually slowing. "It felt so real. I've had the same nightmare 3 times this week, always the same. Fire, hostages, the choice." Beck stroked her hair. "Your mind is trying to process what could have happened, what almost happened, but it didn't. You stopped him before it got that far." Alice pulled back to look at him. "I was so afraid, Beck. Afraid I wouldn't be strong enough, fast enough, smart enough." "But you were," Beck said. "You were all of those things. The nightmare is just fear trying to convince you otherwise. Don't let it win." Alice nodded slowly, her heartbeat finally returning to normal. She lay back down, and Beck held her until she fell asleep again. This time there were no dreams, only peace. The snow melted in rushing torrents down the mountainside. Green shoots pushed up through the thawing earth. Birds returned to the pines, filling the air with song. Alice stood on the newly repaired porch of the cabin, watching Caleb and Lily play in the clearing. Caleb was teaching his sister how to carve, their heads bent together over a piece of soft pine wood. Lily's laughter rang out clear and joyful. Beck came up behind Alice and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "Martha's coming up tomorrow. She wants to talk about building a small cabin near the creek. Says she's tired of town life." Alice smiled. "Tell her yes. The children would love having her close." "And you?" "I'd love it too. She's family. Beck turned Alice around to face him. His expression was serious. I need to tell you something. Judge Farley filed the correct marriage paperwork last week. We're legal now, officially and completely. Caleb and Lily are legitimate in the eyes of the law. Alice let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Good. But that's not all. Beck pulled a small box from his pocket. I want to do this right, the way I should have done it the first time. He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band, engraved with tiny flowers. Alice Merrick Brennan, will you marry me? Again, properly, with witnesses and vows that mean something. Alice's eyes filled with tears. Yes, yes, you stubborn mountain man. I'll marry you as many times as you want. Beck slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, deep and slow and full of promise. When they broke apart, Caleb was standing on the porch steps, watching them with a solemn expression. Does this mean Alice is really our ma now? Forever? Beck knelt down so he was eye level with his son. She's been your ma since the day she saved your life, Caleb. The ring just makes it official. Caleb looked at Alice. Then, in a gesture that made her heart crack open, he stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around her waist. I'm glad you didn't run away, he whispered into her skirt. Alice knelt down and pulled him into a proper embrace, Lily joining them a moment later. I'm never running away, Alice said fiercely. This is my home. You are my family. And I will fight heaven and hell to keep you safe. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon in late May. Judge Farley officiated, his hands steady for the first time in years, his voice clear and strong. Martha stood as Alice's witness. A handful of neighbors from the valley attended, along with Sheriff Kane, who had become an unlikely ally. Alice wore a simple white dress that Martha had sewn, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Beck wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. He looked almost civilized, almost. The vows they spoke were their own. Beck promised to trust Alice with his heart, his children, and his darkest fears. He promised to stand beside her, not in front of her, and to honor her strength as much as her softness. Alice promised to protect their family with everything she had. She promised to be his partner in all things, to remind him daily that he was worthy of love, and to choose him every morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. When Judge Farley pronounced them husband and wife, Beck kissed Alice with such tenderness that several people in the small crowd wiped their eyes. Caleb and Lily threw wildflowers, shrieking with joy. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Copper Ridge rang with the sound of genuine happiness. After the ceremony, they made a pilgrimage. The whole family walked to the high ridge where Sarah Brennan was buried. The grave was marked by a simple wooden cross and a headstone Beck had carved himself. Sarah Brennan, beloved mother, sister, friend. 1847 to 1873, gone but never forgotten. Wildflowers grew thick around the grave, planted by Lily over the past months. Beck knelt and placed a bouquet of fresh mountain laurel at the base of the stone. Sarah, he said quietly, I want you to meet Alice, officially. She's been taking good care of our children, of me, of everything you loved. I think you would have liked her. Lily stepped forward and placed a drawing she had made on the grave. It showed their family, Beck, Alice, Caleb, Lily, and Martha, all holding hands in front of the cabin. In the corner, drawn in softer pencil, was another figure, a woman with long hair and a kind smile, watching over them. That's you, Mama, Lily said. Alice says you're always with us, even if we can't see you. Is that true? Alice knelt beside Lily and wrapped an arm around her. It's true, sweetheart. Your Mama's love is in everything good about this place. In the way your father takes care of you, in the way you take care of each other. Love doesn't die, it just changes shape. Caleb, who had been standing silently beside his father, finally spoke. Ma? The new Ma. Can I ask you something? Anything, Alice said. If you have a baby someday, will you forget about us? Alice's heart broke and mended in the same instant. Caleb Brennan, look at me. The boy met her eyes. I will never, ever forget about you. You and Lily are my first children, my heart children. Any baby that comes after will be their sibling, not their replacement. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded slowly. Then he did something he had never done before. He took Alice's hand and held it. They stood there together, the five of them, in front of Sarah's grave. And Alice understood something profound. This was not about erasing the past. It was about honoring it while building a future. Sarah would always be part of this family, her memory, her love, her sacrifice. But so would Alice. There was room for both. 1 year later, in the spring of 1876, Alice gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and difficult. Beck paced the cabin like a caged animal while Martha attended to Alice. Caleb and Lily sat outside on the porch, holding hands, refusing to leave even when it grew dark. When the baby finally arrived, her cry was strong and healthy. Martha cleaned her and wrapped her in a soft blanket. Then she handed the baby to Alice. Beck sat beside the bed, his large hand trembling as he touched his daughter's tiny fist. "She's perfect," he whispered. Alice looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "I want to name her Sarah." Beck's eyes widened. "Alice, you don't have to—" "I want to," Alice insisted. "Sarah Brennan gave me this family. The least I can do is give her name to our daughter. It's not about replacing her. It's about honoring her." Beck's eyes filled with tears. He leaned down and kissed Alice's forehead. "Sarah Brennan, our Sarah." Caleb and Lily were allowed in to meet their new sister. They climbed onto the bed carefully, staring at the tiny bundle in wonder. "She's so small," Lily breathed. "You were that small once," Martha said from the doorway, smiling. "Will you teach her to carve?" Caleb asked his father seriously. "We'll teach her together," Beck replied. Alice looked around at her family, her husband, her children, her sister by choice. And she thought about the woman she had been a year and a half ago, standing in the dirt at Bitter Creek Station, broken, rejected, alone. That woman would never have believed this was possible. But that woman had not yet learned what Alice knew now. Scars did not make you damaged. They made you whole, because they proved you survived. And survival was the first step to living. Epilogue. 5 years later. The cabin on Copper Ridge had grown. Beck had added 2 new rooms, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The windows gleamed. Flowers grew in neat beds around the foundation. A rope swing hung from the old pine tree. It looked like a home now, not just a shelter. Alice stood in the doorway watching the chaos of a Sunday afternoon. Caleb, now 13, was teaching 9-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Sarah how to identify animal tracks in the mud by the creek. His voice was patient, authoritative. He sounded more like Beck every day. Lily had grown into a beauty, with her mother's delicate features and her father's fierce spirit. She wore trousers more often than dresses and could shoot a rifle almost as well as Alice. Little Sarah was wild and fearless, climbing trees and catching frogs and demanding stories about the mother she had been named for. Beck came up behind Alice and wrapped his arms around her expanding waistline. She was 6 months pregnant with their second child together. "Tired?" he murmured into her hair. "Always," Alice replied, "but happy." Martha's cabin stood 100 yards away, smoke rising from her chimney. She spent her days weaving baskets and teaching the children their letters and making sure her extended family never went hungry. Judge Amos Farley had resigned his position the year before and moved to Denver to be with his daughter Emily. She had used the money from selling her testimony to a journalist writing about frontier corruption to open a small bookshop. Farley worked there now, recommending novels to customers and finally sleeping without nightmares. He had written to Beck once, a short letter that simply said, "Thank you for giving me the courage to be a better man." In the distance, the mountains rose sharp and eternal against the sky. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Alice could swear she heard a woman's voice singing. The Parting Glass, an old song, a song of farewell and remembrance. Alice did not believe in ghosts, but she believed in love that transcended death, and she believed that Sarah Brennan, wherever she was at peace, because her children were loved, Her husband was healed. Her family was whole. Alice had kept her promise. And in the end, that was all that mattered. In the town of Bitter Creek, in the territorial prison, Silas Thornwood sat in a cell and stared at the wall. 20 years with no parole. 20 years to remember the woman who got away. 20 years to hate the scarred bride who destroyed him. But hate was cold comfort, and time moved slowly in hell. He would die there 5 years later, in 1881, alone, unmourned, forgotten. While on Copper Ridge, the Brennan family would grow to include 4 more children, 12 grandchildren, and a legacy of love that would outlast hate by generations. In the end, the devil lost. Love won. And Alice Merrick Brennan, the rejected mail-order bride with a scar on her face and fire in her heart, lived happily ever after. Not because life was easy, but because she was strong enough to fight for her happiness, and wise enough to know it was worth fighting for. The end.